Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're talking to Emily Casper. Emily is a social and cognitive neuroscientist, and she's Associate Professor at the University of Ghent in Belgium. She studies obedience to authority. Her research is particularly interesting as she's carried out much of her research in countries that experienced genocide, and her book Just Following Orders is an excellent read, which led me to reach out to Emily and invite her on. I'm really glad you could join us, Emily. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward.
Hello, Emily. Very nice to meet you. Now, it sounds like your work is building on the famous Stanley Milgram experiments, which were carried out in the 60s. Can you tell us a little bit about that background?
Yeah, indeed. So the work of Milgram is indeed probably the most well-known study ever conducted in psychology, or perhaps in science overall. And it's very famous. It was not the first one who studied obedience in an experimental paradigm, but his studies are very famous because he really went far in terms of the experiment, because his participants were asked to deliver shocks of increased intensity to another third person who had done nothing special. And while it was predicted that no one would administer a very painful shock to the person, to the victim, actually many obeyed until the end. And so, especially in the post World War II era, that was particularly relevant, and that has a strong societal meaning. But actually, it's true that the work I conduct is somehow a continuity of that work. So with Milgram studies, we know that experimentally people can be highly obedient, even if it causes harm to another person. But from those studies, what we have learned mostly is what are the social or contextual factors that influence obedience. He made a lot of variants where people were sometimes facing the person receiving the shocks or not. Sometimes the experimenter was present or not. So we know what increases or decreases obedience. What I try to do is really to understand how is it possible that because we receive orders, we are able to do such actions. Like, what is happening in the brain, what changes in the brain that explain these behavioral extremes.
Right, okay. So just thinking back to the Milgram experiments, because there were some ethical concerns about that. How did you manage to maneuver your way around those?
Yeah, actually it was not an easy point, because there were a lot of ethical concerns indeed. The fact that they used deception, so they lied in a way to the participants by not revealing the true purpose of the study. They caused a lot of emotional distress to the participants who thought that they were killing another person. And so actually, if we wanted to study obedience, we had to create something new in the same line, but to respect ethical standards, which are now very present, and we cannot conduct studies on human participants without having the approval of ethics committee. And some, by the way, even say that it's since Milgram studies that this has become a huge part of study in psychology and neuroscience. And so what we did is that we try to have a paradigm where we won't lie or we won't deceive participants, and also where, yes, there would be harm to be caused, but not as severe as Milgram. So what we do is that we welcome two participants, real participants, so no confederates, and one is assigned to be the agent, and the other one is assigned to be the victim, and they switch their roles at the middle of the study. So they both know what it is like to experience being the agent or the victim. And actually, before we start the study, we use a machine that is attached to the participant's hands, and we determine a pain threshold. And the pain threshold, so we increase step by step, and we try to reach a threshold which is painful but tolerable for the victim. And that threshold is the one that will be used when the victims will receive the shocks during the study. It will never increase, such as in Milgram studies, where shocks were of increased intensity up to potentially a deadly shock. So here, they know it's real, they know it's painful, but they know that this has been chosen by the victim. And so here with this setup, we actually contrast what is happening when people follow orders to harm the victim and what is happening when they make a free decision. So we can really compare what is happening in the brain when we follow orders or when we make regular decisions without any influence.
Thank you. That sounds very complicated. Thinking about how you went around searching for participants, because, obviously the participants are essential, and you can tell us whether you had lots coming forwards, whether it was a popular study, but one of the things you did was to search internationally for participants. Why did you do that?
Yeah. So indeed, when I designed this study with my colleagues, we were not sure that some participants would accept to join because we are very transparent about the goals and the methods. But actually, many people come. We don't really have issues to recruit. Some of them knows the study of Milgram, but some others, they don't. But indeed, when I started this, I started with something which is classic in neuroscience or psychology, meaning that I was recruiting university students from various European countries. But at some point, even though the paradigm was very ecological in the sense that it involved real behaviors and real decisions, I was more concerned about the generalization. This one is always difficult in English. Generalizability of the findings, because university students, they may know what it is like to obey orders, but if I target orders to harm another person, this is very specific. And I was in contact with an NGO working in Central Africa, notably Rwanda, Burundi, or DRC. And after a meeting with them, I started considering that perhaps to study the issue of obedience, I should start to target other people who have been more in contact with the disastrous effects of obedience, but also to ensure that I have a broad diversity of population, because some authors have argued that when we come from a Western country, we are very specific. Actually, we are very peculiar to the rest of the world population in terms of cultures, in regarding how we process information. And so we are actually a very small part of the world population. So I didn't feel comfortable with making conclusions about the human brain by focusing only on a very small portion of human brains. And for me, the issue of obedience, we have seen it across various historical events. So I was also wondering if there was a common ground, like something shared by our species as a whole, or if it was more something specific, like did Milgram would give similar results, for instance, in other cultures.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I can see the point that you're making there, but the implication is that you travel to countries where there's been civil wars, places where groups who've committed atrocities against each other, and then they live side by side. So how easy was it to raise your subject with them?
Yeah, actually, this is always complicated, especially because I'm targeting countries where a genocide occurred. And this is already very different from a war. And in many countries, just seeing war context or genocide context is already a whole political discussion, because some countries do not officially recognize a genocide while others do recognize it. So actually, something that I didn't expect when I started this career in neuroscience and these topics is that I should also learn a lot about the political situation in the country to know exactly, okay, what I can say, what I can't, what is tricky, what is accepted there or not. And I mean, it's another part of the job that I didn't think I would have to manage. But then, for instance, when I conducted this research project in Rwanda, I was also not knowing how they would react to that. They are very open to questions related to the genocide, to academic research related to the genocide, but most of the time it's related to trauma, for instance, or other associated aspects of the genocide, but not necessarily focusing on the perpetrators, on how we can explain those atrocities. It's also very complicated to try to explain how or why the perpetrators act the way they did. That's also very tricky, especially in a society that is trying to recover from such a strong trauma. But so the first step is anyway to request ethics approval from the local institutions, and that was actually directly granted. I was afraid that they would not accept the paradigm, but actually they found the question very relevant for the country. I had the same in Cambodia. And yeah, actually, to recruit participants, people are really willing to participate. I did a first study there with the generation born after the genocide. And last year, I also did the same study with actual former genocide perpetrators and rescuers, so those who resist orders. And actually, many people volunteered. They all reported that they felt well. So yeah, I'm actually surprised, but positively, that people feel really engaged with this topic.
Have you come across the work of Bas Dreisinger, Emily? She wrote Incarceration Nations, and we interviewed her on the podcast, but I think one of the countries she went to was Rwanda, and sort of thinking about how to find different, more progressive ways of achieving justice, really, in countries where they've had genocide.
Yeah, that's complex. And for instance, by working in Rwanda and in Cambodia, I can already see strong differences regarding how justice has been conducted. So, for instance, in Rwanda, I would say that almost all the perpetrators or all the known perpetrators has been condemned during the Gacaca trial. So they really tried to put everyone on trial, to involve the local populations, to ensure that justice would be given. When I was in Cambodia, actually that was more complex. So initially, I was also trying to find former perpetrators, survivors, but actually there only less than 10 people has been condemned for the Khmer regime. And because the way they consider it is that only top leaders should be held accountable, but all the executioners actually should not be prosecuted. And so it means that a significant part of the Cambodian population think that somehow justice was stolen from them, because most of the people who actively participated in the killing acts will never be prosecuted, will never have to fear any justice. And so there, for instance, it was very difficult to know exactly who acted as a perpetrator or not, because it's not known and they have no reason to reveal it. While in Rwanda, it's very open, very transparent for that.
Thank you. It's so interesting to hear about. But people often assume that those carrying out the kinds of atrocities that occur during genocide are psychopaths. What did you find?
Yeah, actually, that's a reflection that I really frequently have. Like when I explain what I'm doing, people sometimes react, you're just working with psychopathic monsters. And I think it's an easy justification because it's hard to imagine that someone is able to commit such atrocities. And so we always tend to go for the more simplistic explanation, and this is one of them, based on a specific dark personality traits. But it's not like that. I mean, we cannot explain that so many people participated in various atrocities and genocide all over the world and across centuries just because they have a dark psychopathic traits that doesn't fit with the actual prevalence of those personality traits. And there is now more a switch in the literature that actually explain that it's more related to the context, to social dynamics. So of course we cannot explain a genocide with a single factor. It's always a complexity of different events and things that happen. But social dynamics such as intergroup relationships, dehumanization, propaganda toward another group, and also peer influence and authority influence actually are known to play a big role in what brings people to simply decide to join those movements or not.
Thank you. And is there an identifiable process that people go through to enable them to commit these kind of acts of harm against others when they're instructed to?
Yeah, so there is actually different stages that has been recognized that precede a genocide. So these stages can occur in parallel or one after the other. And most of the time in all genocides, regardless where they occur, it frequently starts with, in addition to economic and political instability, by a classification process where people are split in different groups. And then there is this dehumanization process along other factors. And then there is the extermination phase. So there is this this organization, Genocide Watch, which that actually lists these stages of genocide and follow up all the countries in the world to say where they are at the moment regarding this towards other groups and which are the groups that are targeted. So there is somehow a pattern that precedes these events. Of course, we cannot fully predict if any of those patterns will lead to such mass extermination, but there are some common elements across the world for that.
Thank you. That's really interesting. In some of these countries, like Rwanda, they recruited children to act as soldiers. How significant might this be in terms of the actions that people were prepared to take?
Yeah. So in Rwanda, some children participated, but not only. Actually, many of the perpetrators that I met were adults when this happened. There were a few children, but more teenagers. But I know it's more significant in other countries, the recruitment of children. And I think it's because they're more, I would not say flexible, that's not the correct word, but we can more easily influence their way of thinking because they are in this process of growing up, of maturing their brain, and so on. And so I think the earlier it starts, of course, the easier learning demo propaganda is. But yeah, in Rwanda, the majority of the perpetrators I met were adults when they decided to participate. So that was somehow a conscious decision made at an age where they could make decisions. And that's also one of the difficulty of studying those topics, is that, for instance, when I'm studying experimentally obedience to authority, I say, okay, why do we obey immoral orders? But during a genocide, those orders to exterminate another part of the population are not considered immoral. They are considered moral, because that actually, for the sake of their society, that the other part of the population should be exterminated. So there is a revision of moral values. And yes, I think that's a critical element to explain the participation to these events.
And you used the word decide then, and I suppose I was wondering whether that's a fair word or not, whether people might be frightened and, what kind of decision is that? But I wonder if your research throws any light on that.
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. The word decide is indeed complex because it's very dependent from one person to another, and also in different countries. So for instance, in Rwanda, I met perpetrators who said, yeah, I decided to join. And I also met less of them, but still a few who said, oh, I was afraid, so I did join. And actually, it was the same in Cambodia. When I asked them, why did you participate in this regime? Some of them said, oh, I was very afraid, so I participate because otherwise I would be killed. And some others just did participate because they thought it was the right thing to do, and they were convinced that it was the right thing to do. So that's always tricky. Also, how coercive those orders were, how it's just because people internally decide that it was the right thing to do. And I think it should be seen as a case by case, like each situation was somehow difficult. But the use of coercion was not systematic.
Thank you. And does participation in genocide change people's brains?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So of course, it's not an easy one, but the way I can answer to it, so there are two ways to answer this question. The first one is we can see as how experiencing the traumatic events changes the brain, because there is a huge literature on trauma experiencing and how it impacts the brain. And we know that the brain is deeply affected, which explains that people surviving a trauma are more susceptible to threats, have frequent nightmares, are constantly in an alert state, for instance. And while most of the research focused on survivors, actually there is also quite a lot of studies now on can be perpetrators, can also be military veterans, for instance, where actually because of what they were asked to do or because of what they did or what they saw, they're also suffering from the same brain alterations. So I think this is the first important point, knowing that even if you are from those perpetrating, it will not, I would say, save you from also experiencing the psychological consequences of it. But another result I was surprised is, so this paradigm on obedience that I created, in a variant of it, people can actually decide to follow or not this order. So they can decide to or obey or to disobey and resist. And when I did a first study in Rwanda on the generation born after the genocide, they were all highly obedient. Almost no one disobeyed. It was very extreme. And I was a bit surprised because it could perhaps be been explained by cultural differences in relationship to authority, because they have a strong cultural relationship to authority, and other cultures were less obedient. And then I started a few months ago a kind of similar study, but as I said, with actual genocide perpetrators and rescuers. And I thought, okay, perhaps they did obey during the genocide. They are also from Rwanda, such as in my first study, so of course they will obey all the time. Actually, they disobeyed a lot, but really a lot. I never saw that before. Not all of them, but a huge majority of them resisted those orders to harm and chose the other option. And when we debriefed them and asked them why, actually a fair number of them reported that it's because it reminded them of the genocide, and because of what they did, they would never be able to do the same again. And that's actually very interesting because it shows that first, it rules out a bit the idea of the personality traits, because it doesn't mean that because one person was able to participate at point A in time, it means that they will do exactly the same later on. Here we really see that somehow they have learned, they have seen the disastrous consequences of what they did, and so they won't do it again. So actually, these are the different changes that we can observe.
It's really interesting to hear that, Emily. I wondered were there any obvious negative consequences to your participants if they didn't follow your instructions?
No, actually, it was not a coercive context in the sense of what could happen. So here we have a paradigm where if they chose to send harm to another person, for instance, a financial harm, like to take some money from another person, they increase their own monetary gain. So they have a benefit from obeying those orders because it increases their own monetary gain. And we have decided this because it really places our participants in front of a moral dilemma. Should I accept to take money from another person to increase my own monetary rewards? And actually, it was inspired by reports that we have from the perpetrators during the genocide, which reports that some of them, they participated because they were able to loot the houses of their victims, for instance. So there was really this money component that was associated with their decisions to participate. When they disobeyed orders, they were not making money. So it was not a strong consequences, but that was still a consequence.
Thank you. A lot of what you're saying, Emily, reminds me of the reading I've done on death squads in Nazi Germany, particularly those who were involved in going to towns and then taking women and children out into the woods and shooting them.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a differential effect upon the individuals who participated in that. Of course, they had little choice. If they refused, then they would have been shot. But some of them went to some lengths to avoid doing it, or some managed to kill a few people, but then found they were sickened, and others, of course, just got on with the work.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, many of them were quite traumatized by that. Did you find that some of your participants were affected in that same way?
Yeah, actually, I found that some perpetrators were really affected by what happened. But it's sometimes also very tricky to speak about the negative psychological consequence that perpetrators can add, because if we take the side of the victim, it's kind of removing their own pain to give it to the person that had contributed to that pain. So these are also tricky topics. That's very important. I think we should raise awareness about living with that, and this is especially common in the military, for instance. Most of them, they can suffer from moral injuries. Like, it's a bit like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders, but it's more related to feeling of guilt or shame for what they did or what they saw. And that's a topic that was not really well known or openly discussed in the military before, but now we have more and more research about that. And some reports that indeed it didn't start directly after the events, but years after, when they really had time to process what they did. And that's where it hit. And yes, I saw that as well with those I interviewed.
So, Emily, the knowledge that you're gathering through your studies, how can this knowledge be used for greater good, do you think?
Yeah, that's really something I try to consider a lot, because I want that these studies serves for science, but also for more to help societal issues. And I think, well, I was mentioning raising awareness and knowing that our brains can be affected by just simply following orders is already a first step to know. And so people can perhaps reflect more on their own individual responsibility or accountability for their events. But I think a promising future idea that I have for that is to focus on those who actually resisted during genocide. So the righteous among the nation, as they are called, following the Holocaust, or the rescuers. I think these people are really a key, because in those events, we know that many people will just follow or just will not act and remain bystanders. But there is a tiny portion of the population who choose to act differently and to resist despite the risk for their own life, while they have evolved in the exact same historical, cultural, social, economic context. And I'm really trying to understand now who they are and how they differ from others. Because I think that if they were able to choose the other path, then if we know better what led them to do this, we can start interventions, we can start perhaps education programs that would mimic their path. And of course, it's never a single factor. Human behaviors is very complex, it's never easy. But that's actually something I started doing last year. Well, meeting, interviewing, and testing genocide rescuers. And for instance, just as a first result among others, something that differed quite a lot between the rescuers and the ex-perpetrators and bystanders is the fact that they benefit from role models from their family members during their childhoods. So a majority of them reported that they witnessed their parents or grandparents also helping people in the past and rescuing people. And of course, it's not absolute. Not all of them had role models. Some perpetrators, for instance, also had role models. But it's really something that significantly and strongly differed between groups. And so it looks like having a role model that is able to do this really influenced the way children are going to process these decisions to risk their life to also help others. And so following this, I'm, for instance, at the moment trying to create a comics for kids and teenagers where I would display the real stories of real life rescuers around the world to really give role models across various cultures, to really show the examples of those people and sharing their stories.
It's really interesting to hear that, Emily, because we've interviewed quite a few whistleblowers on this podcast, and I think what often comes across is quite often they've not been the only person who's been aware of wrongdoing, but something about them has meant their integrity has mattered more to them. They've held on to their principles in a way that other people have been able to cast theirs to one side, perhaps. So interesting to hear about that work.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And actually, I will seize this opportunity to say that if anyone feels that they belong to this category, regardless where they come from in the world, or if they know other people, I would be interested to hear their story, because I really want this book to broadcast the stories of any regular human beings on Earth who was able to resist undue influence and do what is supposed to be the right thing to do. So
we'll make sure we amplify that on social media, Emily, because I know that a lot of people who listen are people who've found themselves in that kind of situation. So certainly glad to help you get participants for that.
Thank you.
Have you learned anything that surprised you during your research?
Honestly, when I'm doing this research, every day is somehow a surprise. For instance, if we start from scratch, when I designed this task, I thought that no one would ever administer a real painful shock to someone else for a very small, tiny monetary reward of 5 cents. Many people actually do it. I also thought that no one would ever obey my orders. Almost all of them did. I thought that the former genocide perpetrators would never disobey my orders because they did obey in the past. And a huge number of them disobeyed pro-socially and refused to do the harmful option to the victim. So actually, I'm always very surprised. Perhaps I'm very not good at predicting the behavior of people. I don't know. But it's certainly a huge human adventure. It's very specific to do this and to move from the classic lab studies that we see in most of this research and to do something more on the field, to hear their stories, to try to understand those people. Yeah, it really is a bit an adventure, honestly.
Emily, you're involved in studying the shadow side of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
What's this been like for you as a journey?
Yeah. I would say, honestly, not always easy. Now it's okay, but when I started doing that, I, of course, had to read a lot about human atrocities. And in the beginning, when you just read every day about that, yeah, of course, it impacts your emotional well-being. There were some days I was feeling super apathic or depressed, or I was doing nightmares when I started reading other interviews conducted with genocide perpetrators regarding what they did. I could barely read 5 pages in a row and I had to stop and I was having nightmares. And yeah, in the beginning, it was really not an easy one. And actually, at some point, you somehow learn, perhaps it's not the right word, but you learn to manage this. You're really motivated by this quest for understanding, and you get accustomed, I would say, to hear this, to read about those atrocities, to imagine the victim, and after a while, that becomes okay. But yeah, most of the time, if you invite me at a family dinner, it will be quite depressing for the whole table for a while.
How do you protect your own wholesomeness? I mean, it sounds like you're shifting from looking at people who cause harm to those who are capable of resisting, and maybe that's part of it. But I wonder if you do anything else to protect your own sense of wholesomeness.
Yeah, so I would give an example, for instance, because we also work in prison with incarcerated individuals. And a rule that we have in my lab is to always be by pair, at least. So during the day, we conduct the studies and so on. And then on the way back, then we can debrief. We can speak about how we felt, at least with another person. And actually that helps to be able to discuss that with other people, to always have someone else with you who is experiencing and hearing and doing something similar. And I think that helps. For me, that helped a lot, but also the fact that, yeah, I accustom myself to hearing this and so on. Yeah, actually, I think it's very dependent from one person to another. Some people also say that it's why interviews with genocide perpetrators are so rare, because that's very difficult to hear all this. I think the days that were the most difficult were when I had to alternate between the survivors, so the victims, and the perpetrators, because you hear one side of the story and then the other side of the story, and your job is to remain completely neutral and to analyze this and to understand all of them. But that really requires a lot of strong emotional balance.
Yeah, it must be really challenging to manage to hold both those accounts in your head at one time. And as you were talking, I was reminded of a conversation we had with Shona Minson, who's a researcher who researches children whose parents are in prison, and she spoke about the profound emotional impact of hearing those painful stories. It seems as if often there isn't clinical supervision, reflective practice about the work, when obviously it's going to have an emotional impact to be hearing these kind of really painful stories.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, something that helped also was writing this book and writing the next ones, because that's also a way for me to, because of course there is the scientific part, but there is also the human part and more autobiographical part of explaining how I felt at that moment, how I process this information. And I think writing for me is a process that helps a lot, for instance.
Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you so much.
So, do you have a date for the book? What's the timeline?
Yeah, so the book Just Following Orders has been published last September, and now I'm working on the next ones. One of the next will be on the rescuers specifically. I try to understand how they differ from the others, and I will share their stories as well as the neuroscientific investigation. But for this one, I don't have a timeline yet because I'm really at the beginning of writing it, 2 chapters so far. And then there is this book for kids and teenagers that I'm hoping to do. So I'm in the process of doing it, and actually it will be finalized when I will have found different stories that can be included in the book.
So keep in touch with us and we can always post afresh.
Yeah,
Thanks
great.
very much indeed. That was a very moving conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.